right, so here we are with another installment of Texas History via YouTube, or any way that this is distributed. Well, anyways, we'll talk about today, further in Texas geography, we'll talk about the Colorado River. Colorado River, like the Brazos River and the Trinity Rivers, runs through the heart of central Texas, emptying into the Gulf of Mexico around the city of Wharton. Well, anyways, when we talk about the Colorado River, its name is of course, Spanish name, like most of the rivers of Texas are. It is a reference to the word reddish. So when we talk about the Colorado River, it is fair to remember that if you've ever been on it and looked around it, whether it's northwest of Austin, what are called the Highland Lakes, or in Austin, they're crossing it on I-35 or Mopac or one of those other major thoroughfares, maybe Congress Avenue, Lake Lady Bird Johnson's, I think as they call it now. It used to be Town Lake. And then, of course, maybe all the way down to Bastrop or LaGrange or somewhere else. And if you look at that Colorado River, you must be wondering, has there been some sort of seismic change in the history of Texas geography and geology? It's ground and sand and dirt and all that, because it really looks nothing like a reddish river. It doesn't have a red tint to it for the most part, unless it was in a flood stage or something of that nature, which, considering the geography and the rainfall in central and west Texas that it drains, really doesn't have all that much rain. So why was it? And so that would be one of those little factoids you may amaze your friends and family with. But the fact is that Texas, or rather the Spaniards, when they were mapping Texas hundreds of years ago, probably in the mid-1500s it seems like, but when there was some exploration in Texas and the maps that were drawn and then sent back to Spain one way or the other, they were being copied. And one of the copiers, one of the cartographers, a map maker, the fancy word for map maker, one of the cartographers accidentally got Brazos and Colorado backwards. So that's the thinking as to why, I would not say I would swear my life on it, swear on a Bible, but I would say this. That's probably a good answer for why is the Colorado River called that and not, red, or why was the Brazos River, which actually looks much more reddish than does the Colorado, why was it called Los Brazos de Dios? So the thing is they probably got them switched. So the Brazos River should have been originally called the Colorado, or was originally called the Colorado, and the Colorado the Brazos. Yet at the same time, a Spanish cartographer is not going to know the difference between the two, and he's just transposing or transcribing a map, or just copying a map, and he messes it up. So, accidents in history sometimes have some consequence, sometimes great consequence. This would not be one of those great moments in history, the hinge of history sort of deal, but it is an important thing to note. Well, anyway, so the Colorado River, reddish, and we're not going to focus on it, though there was a lot of cotton in the days of cotton growth in Texas, grown along its boundary, basically from Austin southward to the river, to the Gulf. But the Colorado River that we're going to talk about today has to do with the life of one man in particular and all that goes around it, and that man's name is Lyndon Johnson. In the 20th century, there are few characters in Texas history that are larger or more consequential than Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson will become the first president of the United States that was from Texas. He is, of course, going to have been vice president, Senate Majority Leader. He was born in the Hill Country. His life story, his biography lends to this discussion about Texas geography and Texas history. And so I guess what you could do is you can just settle in and listen to me talk about Lyndon Johnson for a while. A fascinating character, crude, ambitious, the consummate politician. Some people would say, and I think it at times is very true, without any principles or morals or scruples. I think that's true, but at times very effective as a Senate Majority Leader and also as president, particularly with regard to the issue of civil rights and civil rights legislation. because it was under Lyndon Johnson, the President of the United States, and even before that, Majority Leader, but especially as President, that the Civil Rights Acts of the mid-'60s and even the Voting Rights Acts are able to be gotten through the Congress because of his special knowledge and ability to navigate the shoals and pitfalls and the whirlpools of legislation that could wreck anything, any civil rights legislation going through the Congress. And that's what had happened for years and years and years. Until Johnson figured out where all the bodies were buried, figuratively, of course, and where all those pitfalls and those traps were set, and he was able to maneuver them through. He was able to move the chessboard. He was a master politician. He was a master strategist with regard to that. His legacy as president, and I'm not going to focus that much on his legacy as president because my interest is more Texas history and his impact upon Texas directly. But his legacy upon as president of the United States, certainly his crown jewel of his historical record is going to be his actions in the civil rights realm. It is arguable that a lot of those civil rights pieces of legislation would not have gotten through the Congress. And we don't know because history did not turn this way, but they may never have gotten through the Congress, at least not in anybody's lifetime, or at least not in 20 years or so, without the special work and efforts of Johnson and his subordinates. Because, quite honestly, for all the ballyhooed, and for those of you watching this at this time probably have grandparents who were baby boomers. For the baby boomers, one of the climactic issues of their life is going to be John F. Kennedy. One of the things that if you were to ask a baby boomer who was born prior to 1963 and could remember it, you would ask him, say, where were you when President Kennedy was shot? And people like in my generation with 9/11 or yours with some event, maybe this year, I don't know, meaning 2020, you will say, I was in college. I was at this. And for me, 9/11, I can remember quite vividly, which is 9/11, 2001, quite vividly. I can remember being in graduate school over at Texas State or Southwest Texas University at the time. And I just remember I'd slept in, which I did back then, which I don't today. I get up at about 5:30 in the morning now. But back then I slept in till about 8:30, and my radio clock, which I'd had set, and I'd always listen to the I guess you'd say the morning news out of San Antonio, WOAI. Some of you may know that old station. Anyways, I always had it set and would go off, and I'd kind of lazy through it and all that. This is before iPhones, of course. And they were talking about a plane, and I'm waking up, and they're talking about a plane that had crashed into the Twin Towers, and then another one, and on from there. I quite vividly remember that morning when the towers were hit. In an analogous sort of way, you're going to have people, baby boomers especially, who are going to remember and say, I remember when Kennedy was shot. And he, for the longest time, and even to a certain degree today, if you were to say about Kennedy, something untoward, not kind, frankly honest about John F. Kennedy, a.k.a. Jack Kennedy, well, you would probably get pilloried in public. And in certain circles, especially in Massachusetts, for example, or up in New England, you might be hounded out of polite society because you were attacking and criticizing a secular saint, a guy who had been shot for the cause or some sort of stuff like that. When in reality, Kennedy's presidency was checkered at best, and with regard back to civil rights and our main discussion of Johnson today, Kennedy couldn't move civil rights, even if he wanted to, but he didn't. I don't think he wanted it all that bad, and he had more important for him, bigger priorities. But he wasn't able to move it. And a lot of those progressive liberals back then in the mid-1960s or even the 1950s who had dreams about integration, civil rights acts and laws and such, they were impotent in the face of the master politicians in the Senate who were Southerners, who knew how to use the machinery of the United States Senate, the rules of the Senate, to keep any consequential legislation at bay. They talked a good game, the progressives did, the liberals did in the 1950s and 60s, but their actual logistics and mechanics of actually getting what they talked about into law didn't go very far. But it took a Lyndon Johnson who may not have always talked out of the same side of his mouth. Johnson can be two-faced, and I think that's fair to remember about the man's personality and character. He could be two-faced, he could speak out of both sides of his mouth, but he was a master politician. And while I would love it if a politician was completely honest, and some of them frankly are, the bigger the politician, sometimes it seems like the bigger the man or woman, it seems like they'll tell you what you want to hear, at least to some degree, in order to keep people from getting mad at them. The thing to understand, and I'll say this again probably in this course, and I've said it elsewhere, is that if you want to be a man of principle, that's all fine and good, and you need men of principle. However, especially in the political realm, a man of principle or a woman of principle is also going to attract a lot of arrows and slings and hatchets and knives in the back and in the front and everywhere. In the sense that, having principles means that you have to stand for them and you have to argue on behalf of them or take a pounding when even your friends would rather you give them up and run away from them. Sometimes it seems like it's more advantageous, and it probably is from a purely political or I guess you could say maybe I say relativistic, but just simply a practical method to say, kind of take the idea of the old comedian, now long dead, Groucho Marx. And he said once, it was in one of his movies, he said, "Those are my principles, and if you don't like them, I have others as well." But if you have principles, that can get you in trouble. If you tell the truth, that too can get you in trouble. Now, I argue that you ought to tell the truth. I think that's important in society and in politics and culture and so forth as a general rule, as a proverb and a maxim. But you got to also keep in mind it doesn't always work so well. Anyways, that's the issue. Is that Johnson, who wasn't always very principled, but he had a few. But one of, I guess you could say, for Johnson, if you looked at him at the end of the day on the presidential side, and you could look back into his career as a congressman and as a senator, for Lyndon Johnson, it seemed like the one thing that he was particularly passionate about in a good way, beyond the less good of enriching himself or drawing more power to himself and becoming more powerful, was the fact that he did have a soft spot in his heart. He had a real passion to help those who had been disfranchised, those who were beat down by official or unofficial segregation or oppression and so forth. You could see that actually in his congressional career it was a senator, as I recall. But when this Hispanic or Mexican-American GI had been denied burial down in, I believe it was Three Rivers in Live Oak County, and it was a big deal. And it was mostly because the guy was Hispanic, and he'd fought, and I remember he serves. He died in the country during World War II. This would be about like 1948, 49 territory. Probably had to go back and read all the details once more. Anyways, the man died, and whether he died in the war or right after, but he was a veteran, and they wanted to bury him there in the main cemetery, and I guess Three Rivers, and they basically said, no, that you've got your own cemetery, go over there. Well, it caused a big uproar in South Texas amongst the Hispanic community, as you might expect. Johnson intervened and got the man buried up at Arlington National Cemetery, which is, of all the cemeteries in American secular or civic society, it is probably the most hallowed ground because, it is Arlington. And when people say that he's going to be buried at Arlington, everyone knows or should know what that means. It's where Kennedy is buried. It is where many men are buried, some famous, some less so, but all have a reason, in a sense, to be buried there. At least the vast majority do. But which is to say is that Johnson intervened. He was an important senator, and senators do favors for each other. And the Eisenhower administration it would have been the Truman administration, the Truman administration actually had integrated the Army. They made it happen, and so it worked out in that sense. He also, Johnson, I want to chase his thread a little further. Johnson is going to, I think, find his voice or find his principles in the good way on the issue of civil rights when he was a substitute and more particularly a first-year teacher in South Texas. And he was down at, I was about to say Hondo. It was not Hondo. It was in South Texas, down I-35. It was, I almost want to say Pearsall. I need to look that up too. But at the same time, it was southwest of San Antonio, basically along that Divine, Dilley, Pearsall sort of territory out that way. And he taught because Texas schools were segregated back in the 1930s when he was teaching. And so he was teaching at a segregated school. And it was segregated between white and Hispanic. And so they had very little. The school district was poor in general. But anyways, what money they did have, they reserved for the Anglo kids. But Johnson taught there for a year, taught debate, amongst other things. And he didn't take, basically, woe is me, you're feeling sorry for yourself as an answer. Anyways, but he saw it, and he saw the injustice or the wrongness of it all, and it kind of think it seared him. Again, this is not to turn Lyndon Johnson into some sort of perfect man. The way I try to teach history, frankly, is that you see the man for what he was, as best I can tell it. And of course, I'm going to have my opinion of a man or a woman in history. I will say that. But at the same time, to turn him into a saint walking on water with no flaws, that does us no good either. That's just hagiography. So anyways, Lyndon Johnson, I do think, has some very strong points as president. That's his crown jewel. It's his capstone. It's the most important thing he does is the civil rights stuff. Is he the only one is it fair to say that if you didn't have Lyndon Johnson, you wouldn't have had civil rights? No, but I don't think you can cut him out either and say it would have happened without him. I just don't think that's the way the history reads. I think he had to be in there, and he was part of the cog, along with other characters that you find in the 1950s and 60s in the civil rights movement. Well, anyways, all of which is to say that's his good side. This next part about his presidency, and I'm just going to mention this quickly, happens to be the fact that when you talk about Johnson, his mixed bag probably depends on your view of politics. If you come from a conservative, libertarian, small government, free market sort of thinking, if that's your philosophy on the way the government should act or rule or do, then quite honestly, you probably would not like Johnson in his Great Society or his war on poverty. The overarching plan, you might as well put this in your notes, is called the Great Society. And one of the aspects of the Great Society is the war on poverty. And Johnson, he had a soft spot in his heart, and like I said, in this case, this is where he had a tender heart. In some respects, you actually find him there, and you're like, okay, he's trying to do something. But what he does it work? I mean, you're going to get Head Start, amongst other things. Many of the Medicare, Medicaid, many of the social safety net programs that, for good and for bad, take off and are part of the constellation of the things that the U.S. government does to this day were started under Lyndon Johnson or expanded greatly under Lyndon Johnson and expanded after that. Did they work? I mean, that's one of the issues you got to ask. I mean, intentions are nice, but sometimes you also have to ask, did the thing work? And so with Johnson and his Great Society and his not New Deal, but he was influenced, of course, by it. But Johnson's Great Society and the war on poverty, your answer to the question of did it work and was it the right thing to do probably depends on your politics and your view of what the government should do or should not do. And that's not trying to be coy on my part. I think it's just an assessment at this point. Even today, I would argue it's checkered at best. Of course, I tend from a more conservative mindset, I guess you could say. But it is a mixed bag, in my opinion. Others will say, no, this was some of the golden age of American presidential politics. Okay. So all that to say, those are two big ones. And the third big one on Johnson's presidency, and it will always probably be the tin can tied around his leg, and that is Vietnam. I have seen over the years there has been some who have tried to resurrect his Vietnam idea and strategy and doing this and that and trying to make it work out well. Reality is that I think Lyndon Johnson was it was a full-on mess and a mistake to have gone to Vietnam. We lost that war. There's no two ways about it. We got a bunch of people killed that way and a bunch more wounded, and it scarred the country in a way that even to this day you'll find some old Vietnam veterans who were never quite the same again. I think it's fair to say that a lot of men who go serve in war, in combat, and I'd be blunt about this, you see it in the First World War, you see it after the Second World War, you see it after Vietnam. Shoot, you've seen it here in the in the 21st century. I suppose this is the case for all wars. A lot of times, what you end up finding is that some men come home, some men don't, meaning they die on the battlefield or a disease or something, and then other men come home and they're never the same again. Now, and if you've seen combat, you're never going to be the same. That just seems to me a fairly easy statement to make with regard to being in the Army, being in the Marine Corps, or any other combat arm, especially combat close-up, hand-to-hand, rifle. When we think of soldiers marching, that's what I'm really kind of referring to. You're never going to be the same again. But for some men, they really aren't, and they descend into, after the war is over and they come home, they descend into mental illness, post-traumatic stress syndrome disorder, PTSD. Maybe they have physical scars that never heal, but it also brings on the mental psychological stuff. You saw a lot of men who lived through World War I, but came home, and eventually when the bottom fell out of the Depression in the 1920s and especially the 1930s, they became the vagrant travelers. They became the Okie hobos and so forth. There's a lot of them like that. Again and again, you see that. After World War II, you saw that same sort of thing as well. And again, I'm not saying everybody who fought in those wars comes back like that, but more than a few men are scarred. Even to this day, friends of mine who are in the law enforcement community were talking about, say, vagrants who are under the say vagrants or homeless, as it were, who are under the what do you call those things? The overpasses, and you've seen them in major Texas cities and even around here in Bryan College Station. I asked them, I'll ask them occasionally, are some of those veterans? And they say, oh yeah, a lot of them are veterans. It scars and it changes. And so in that sense, the legacy of Johnson in Vietnam is that it leaves tremendous scars in that generation. Also, during Johnson's presidency, it also is going to stir up the young baby boomers, who are now your grandparents or great-grandparents. The baby boomers, the late 1960s, that was, for some of them, their moment of radical truth. And I don't mean all of them. In fact, I don't mean a majority of baby boomers. But there was an element in the baby boom generation. And so I might as well define this too. The baby boom generation is basically from 1945 till about 1965 or 70. They would have been the children of the World War II generation. Anyways, those baby boomers who grew up and came of age in the late 1960s, you will find a strident and at times militant fanatical radicalism amongst them. Not every time and every place, but that generation is going to have an impact. And it was the same generation that not every baby boomer marched in the streets. Not every baby boomer. In fact, most did not. But in certain parts of the country, say California comes to mind, New York, other places, Austin even to a lesser degree, you're going to see riots in the streets. And of course, they gin out some chants. Hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? Sort of thing. And that's attached to his legacy. Also during the late 1960s, during the Johnson administration, and it does go into the Nixon administration as well, but that radicalism of the 60s is also going to produce some of the most horrible race riots in the United States. You're going to see bombings on a scale that we do not have in this country at this point in time, and have not had for years. You're going to have, like I said, race riots in Watson, Los Angeles, race riots in Chicago, race riots in Detroit. You're going to have the 1968 Democratic National Convention devolve into a gigantic brawl melee between the Chicago police and protester rioters. I mean, it depends on who you're talking about. Some of those groups in the 1960s were peaceful protesters, and basically nonviolence was their answer to laying the issue out, whether it's in civil rights or the Vietnam War or something else. But there were other groups, particularly with regard to the war and to a far lesser degree in the civil rights movement. But there were other groups, especially with regard to the war and they would say social injustice, that took up and said peaceful protest does not work, nonviolence does not work. The answer is violence, and so there's your bombings and back and forth they go. It's a turbulent period, and whether you like it or not, a man who is president of the United States, in this case Lyndon Johnson, is going to be blamed for it because he is the president. Any man who sits in that chair, he may try to shed the blame, some accept it, or some pull the Truman, which he always had on his desk a sign that says the buck stops here, which was mostly true for Truman. He did act that way. That's the lot you have when you are the president of the United States. And Johnson's coveted the presidency. Almost every man who becomes president wanted to be president. Very few didn't. I mean, but most of them. And Johnson was one of the most ambitious out there. And so it's part of the deal for him. All right, so we got Johnson in that case taken care of as a president. He serves 2 terms, of course, or it's going to be a term and a half, basically. He fills out the Kennedy term, and then he has one of his own when he crushed Barry Goldwater in the 1964 election. Johnson wanted a second term to fulfill his legacy, but because of all the riots and stuff, because of all the social upheaval that you had in 1968, Johnson was just not popular enough, let alone the Vietnam War, grinding away and eating away his popularity. So anyways, that takes us the presidency of Johnson, and I'll probably tell his story now all the way up to when he becomes president. And so that would be kind of a backwards way of doing it, but sometimes you can open with a large introduction and get some stuff out of the way that you're not going to focus on, and then you can tell the larger story. So when it comes to Lyndon Johnson, he is going to be born in the hill country of Texas. He's born out around Johnson City, which is named for some of his ancestors. But then again, saying, not everybody whose last name is Johnson is going to be are related. If that was the case, half the nation would be related. But anyways, I say that jokingly, but Johnson is one of the most common last names in all of the United States. It's up there with Smith, Jones, and Gonzalez. I think in Texas, that's one of the most common names, and so forth. But it's a common surname amongst Anglos. Anyways, Lyndon Johnson comes out of the hill country of Texas, and being born around the year about 1912 or 10. I have to check the exact date. But basically being born in the first decade or so of the 20th century did not mean you were born into modernity. And so that's where we kind of begin the story of Lyndon Johnson, being born in the hill country of Texas. And if you've ever been out that way, we call it the hill country. They're smallish. They're not mountains. They are hills. Basically limestone hills, and it's a hard scrabble existence. Johnson's father his name is Sam Ely Johnson, and Sam Johnson is several things. Number one, he is a politician. Sam Johnson is what you can call in your notes a populist politician. The populist movement in the late 19th and early 20th century was a hybrid form of a farmers movement, especially in Texas. You'll have some prominent individuals in Texas who are quasi-populist. The governor, Jim Hogg, would be an example, H-O-G-G. And Hogg was, I say he was quasi-populist. He was a Democrat, but at the same time, he'd play footsie with the populists. The populists are out there. They claim, and their idea is that the little man, in this case the farmer, has been ignored, and the farmer has been mistreated by finance, has been mistreated by bankers, has been mistreated by railroads, has been mistreated by or worked over by telegraph operators, and on and on and on we can go. And that the deck is essentially stacked against the farmer, and the farmer needs relief. The farmer needs help. He needs the instrumentality of the government to help protect him and protect his farm from the aggressive rapaciousness of the I guess you could say the corporate elite. And normally understand this when we talk about farmers and the populace, one of the great boogeymen of the populist movement was that of the railroad. I touched on the crash at Crush in 1896. and I only told part of the story. I told the details of the story, sure, but I don't know that I know I did not straight up say this to you, but one of the things that made a crash like that, a demolition derby of two old trains ramming into each other, so interesting and satisfying to people isn't just the idea of seeing two trains crash into each other. That's probably the main thing, is a lot of folks want to see crack-ups. I mean, I used the expression of the rubberneck, the people looking around to see a crack-up. People to this day go to see demolition derbies. Maybe one of the most exciting things that you, as a kid, went to was a carnival. And in that carnival was bumper cars. And you knew you were going to get away from it, and you're going to walk away from it. And as a kid, that's fine. But as an adult, we oftentimes like to see a little more blood. I mean, I would argue in the same vein as far as the idea of wanting to see things break up and get hurt and broke up, that's part of the popularity of such things as the UFC. Because you're hoping to see somebody's ankle break. That's me being a little bit cynical. I admit that. But at the same time, I think it's in that same sort of realm. Well, anyways, also has to be playing in the background in 1896 with that crash at Crush is the fact that these are railroads. And there are a lot of people who thought the railroads were one of the great incubuses of the day. And so seeing two rail cars crack up, might have a little bit of a satisfying effect beyond just wanting to see two trains crack up. Well, anyway, Sam Ely Johnson is a friend of the farmer. He wants to be a friend of the farmer. He wants to help the farmer and to do and so forth. And he pushes various forms of legislation that are designed to increase the farmer's selling power with regard to cotton or to corn, cooperatives, restrictions on railroads, and so forth and so on. Sam Ely Johnson is a man of principle. And it's fair to say when you talk about Sam Johnson is that he was an honest man. Unlike his son, Lyndon Johnson would take money and he'd take in the scheme of things with Lyndon Johnson, you're not going to say that he took bribes, but it was pretty close. Sam was clean when it came to money, and arguably you can look at his life and say he was a good man, and he did not his hand was not in the proverbial till. But at the end of Johnson's life, you look at Sam Ely and you're like, my gosh, the man had no money. He was, after he'd been a state representative, and if you know anything about Texas state government, being a state representative in Texas is not an enriching position if you were honest. In fact, it is a position that impoverishes you if you were honest. Because if you're trying to take bribes, or if you're trying to take stock advice to make it a little more modern, if you reject that and you're trying to be clean and pure and principled, getting paid $7,200 a year to be a state representative, especially in a modern sense that takes up your time, a lot of your time, your finances, unless you're independently wealthy, will be shipwrecked. And so Johnson was poor, and he became poorer because of his service in the legislature, and it is what it is. But also, I think it's fair to say this about Sam Ely Johnson, and put this in your notes as well, is that Sam Johnson was a cotton farmer. But he wasn't a cotton farmer in the Brazos River Valley. He was not a cotton farmer down toward Wharton. He was a cotton farmer not at LaGrange. He was a cotton farmer in the hill country of Texas. And for those of you who have hunting leases there in the hill country, you're thinking to yourself, how the hell do you grow cotton in the hill country of Texas? And the answer is not very well. Because even in the 19th and early 20th century, when they tried to grow cotton in that part of the world, well, the problem is that the soil is thin, it's rocky, and what soil you have will wash off rather quickly, and it just doesn't rain consistently enough. Yet, like trying to grow cotton out around Abilene, they're going to try for a generation or so until either they can't borrow any more money, they're foreclosed upon, or they give up hope and go elsewhere and do something else. But Sam Johnson tried to grow cotton on the Texas Hill Country, and Sam's married to a beautiful woman. Lyndon Johnson's mother is Rebecca, and she was urbane. She was cultured, and she herself said later on when she starts to reminisce about her life. Lyndon Johnson's mother and Sam's wife basically said the first few years of the hill country were the worst of her life. Living in the hill country around the year 1900 was a primitive existence. And so I think you need to put that in your notes next. It is a very primitive existence. By 1900, portions of the United States portions of the United States in the 1900, at the year 1900, especially cities like New York, Washington, San Francisco, even Galveston, Houston, are going to have electricity. You're going to have, maybe not, it's not going to be like we have electricity abundantly and everywhere and cheap, but you had electricity and they were in many, many, many homes. But out in the hill country of Texas, electricity is a far thought away. It's nowhere close, and it's not going to be close. To borrow a phrase that I've used in U.S. history, it's a quote by a guy named Henry Adams. You might as well write his name down because I've become fond of this quote because I think it's true, especially when you talk about the changeover from the past to the present, is the fact that when you say Henry Adams and you talk about the changes that are happening as far as to a man or a woman's life, this is big stuff. And he said it like this: a boy born in 1854 stood closer to the year one than he did 1900. Now, Henry Adams, to my knowledge, never stepped foot in Texas. He may have. But Henry Adams is an Adams of the Adams family, like John and John Quincy Adams. Those were his direct ancestors. One was a great-grandfather and the other grandfather. But anyways, Henry Adams was a writer in the mid-19th century, around the turn of the 20th century. And he could look back in his lifetime and make that, frankly, correct assessment. If you lived in the hill country, you stood closer to the year one than you did to 1900. So, I mean, even with the changes around you, modernity had not come to the hill country around the time of Lyndon Johnson's birth. It was Johnson's mother said basically that those first couple years prior to my children coming were the hardest of my life, and once my kids came, Johnson was the oldest. That made life better. Anyway, so Lyndon Johnson is born, and he's born to a hardscrabble existence. His father, by the time Johnson's a 8 or 10-year-old boy, is already failing as a cotton farmer. He's borrowed money. He has no money. Cotton prices are low. You're coming into the beginnings of the Depression, especially in the farm area. And Lyndon Johnson himself will always be reminded of how poor he was as a kid. The fact that you would have in Johnson City or other little hamlets where Sam had borrowed money to buy groceries. And what I don't mean like gone down to the bank, signed a note, and borrowed money. You didn't do that. But what I mean by borrow money is you went down to the grocery store and on credit you bought food from the grocery store. And, depends on the store and your account, rather your credit. Depends on how much that you paid in excess of what the marked value was. Anyways, people would sit there and send notes to Johnson. If they saw Lyndon Johnson walk by, they'd say, "Boy, come here." And Johnson would come by and they would hand him a note, and he'd read the note, and inevitably it'd say, "Would you please pay your bill?" In essence, Sam Ely Johnson, state representative, populist, honest man, was in some respects, and I don't mean this as a bad thing, it was just what it was, and not a bad thing. I'm not trying to slam him, but he was considered a deadbeat on his bills. He had no money. And so for Lyndon Johnson, his lack of money fired him to make money as an adult, for good and for bad, because he will make money hand over fist in ways that frankly were below board. But his desire to not be poor again, especially as an adult when he came close to money and in contact with money, is going to color him and affect him. It affects his psyche in many respects. Probably affected why he married the white woman he did, his wife, Lady Bird. Anyways, but Johnson and money, that's part of his story. But growing up in the hill country, and I want to make this point now because it's going to start tying into Johnson, the man, but growing up in the hill country is hard. Now let me do it this way. Johnson, after going through grade school, was able to scrape up enough money to get into Texas State Teachers College, or Southwest Texas Teachers College as it was called back then. And as you should notice, the way I say it is that I kind of slipped and called it Texas State Teachers College. Today it's Texas State University, and some of you have friends who go to San Marcos, and that's the University of Lyndon Johnson, or College of Lyndon Johnson. By the way, that is going to be something that people will laugh at him about, especially the Mayflower New England boys, the Kennedy types. who all, for legacy reasons, went to, not all of them, but all the Kennedys anyhow, for legacy reasons went to Harvard. And they all laughed at Johnson, said, where did he go to school? To a damn teacher's, excuse me, pardon for the profanity, but to nothing but a damn teacher's college in San Marcos, Texas. Who'd ever heard of Southwest Texas Teachers College? But when you're a poor boy, like Johnson was in the 1920s and now 1930s, getting into college, you went where you could get in. And Johnson, he went to Texas State or Southwest Texas Teachers College there in San Marcos. He painted houses. He did whatever he could. But it's also fair to remember when Johnson went to Southwest Texas Teachers College, is that he started a practice and a policy that he's going to carry for the rest of his life, at least while he's in a subordinate position. When he becomes the source of power, whether that is the Senate Majority Leader or President of the United States, Lyndon Johnson will drop that charade very quickly. But Johnson's a cunning and a man full of guile, Guile. And one of the things he did, he could also play the role of sycophant. That would be my word. But he could certainly play the role of surrogate son. And Johnson had the uncanny ability, starting out in college, but going all the way through his most of his professional or political career, of playing the role of surrogate son, trusted son, oftentimes loyal son to older men. He did that to the president of Southwest Texas Teachers College. When he gets into the Congress in the 1930s, he's going to do that to Sam Rayburn. You better write that man's name down. Rayburn's an important man. Sam Rayburn of Fannin, Texas, or Fannin County, Texas. Up there, Bonham particularly is the town he's from. But anyways, when you talk about Rayburn, it was also true of a guy named Richard Russell of Georgia, Senator Russell of Georgia. And you see this, he even tried a little bit with Franklin Roosevelt, but didn't get quite so far. But especially men who were bachelors or divorcees or widowers or had no children, Johnson, and they were particularly in positions of power because Johnson loved power and he wanted to attach himself to power. That was part of his MO in life, I would argue. So anyways, Johnson attached himself to Sam Rayburn, who was a divorcee and had no kids. And so Johnson acted as a surrogate son and, in a sense, friend and political ally of Sam Rayburn. They would have their moments, but for the most part, that was a fairly close relationship. To me, it's clear Johnson used Rayburn as much as he could to advance his own career. But that's not unusual. It's just a politician being a politician, and he was good at it. But in addition to that, he did it to Russell, who was a Southern Democrat. And early on in Lyndon Johnson's political career in the U.S. Senate, in 1949 or so, 1950, Richard Russell was the head of the Southern Caucus, and Johnson early on in his career was strongly anti-civil rights. I wouldn't say rabidly so, not like a Mississippi senator or something like that, like Theodore Bilbo. But certainly he was anti-civil rights because Texas in the early 1950s was, we can talk about being Western, and there's some truth to it, but we were also very Southern in our outlook. And Johnson in the early 1950s was not ready to shed the segregation stuff because he wasn't politically secure enough at that point in time. Well, anyways, Johnson attaches himself to Russell, which brings him power and influence and entree into the U.S. Senate. Eventually gets him to the Senate majority slot. So he has this ability to attach himself to power, and that's worth noting right there. Johnson, really, to be fair, is a master politician. I've said that in many respects, in many ways. And one of the best ways I can illustrate this point to you is to ask you this question. Or tell you this story and then ask you the question about why did he do it. So Johnson was before he was a congressman, before he was a senator, before he was president, he was a page or an aide in Washington. He got the smell of politics because of his dad. Sam took him to the legislature when he was a boy, and he said, I loved it. I loved the politics. I loved being around all that. He loved the power. I mean, he loved it all. He loved it all. Loved the glory. And so Johnson, pretty much from the day he was old enough to chart his course, he decided, you know what, I want to be a politician. And so Johnson, in his early, or late teens, and actually it'd be early 20s, he becomes a page and an aide to Dick Kleberg, Richard Kleberg. Dick was his nickname, or it was like saying Will or Billy to William. But Dick Kleberg was a congressman from South Texas, and Johnson worked for the man. But in the first day that Johnson was to go to work, it's kind of like the first day of school for the aides. Johnson, who was poor at that point still and had not become the great Lyndon Johnson, Johnson is he's living in a boarding house with a whole lot of other aides to congressmen and senators who were also poor. And he went that first morning. He went and took eight showers that morning. He took 8 showers. Now, why did he do that? Why did Lyndon Johnson on that first morning as a page in a boarding house? And to be clear about this, he did not have his own showering suite. It was a communal shower setup. Many of you are probably not familiar with this unless you played sports in high school and your school was old-fashioned and they hadn't upgraded the facilities just yet. But think of a communal setting where you have a couple of mirrors and a handful of sinks and a handful of shower heads. And so that's the sort of setting we're talking about here. So why would Johnson take 8 showers that first morning? Why would he do it? And if you're thinking, and as I pause there with that pregnant pause, if you're thinking Johnson felt dirty and he wanted to get clean, that's not it at all. It's political. This is the master politician already showing how the ability to think 2 or 3 steps ahead. Most of his fellow pages probably were never going to be anything more than a page. Maybe some of them go back home and run and become mayor of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, or something like that. Maybe a few of them they're going to become a senator and become prominent. Most won't do that. Of course, Johnson's going to become president, so he's one of just a handful in our history. But Johnson, the reason he took all those showers is he wanted to get to know people. And most people, when you're in the shower with them and you're getting shaved and cleaned up and putting on the aftershave and all that sort of thing, most people aren't thinking that you're sizing them up, that you're trying, that this guy who's talking to you is actually basically sounding you out, feeling you out, trying to figure out, is this somebody I need to waste my time on? Is this somebody I need to get close to? Is this somebody I don't? Some of those pages had been there for a few years. Not all of them were just newbies like Johnson was. He was, in a sense, most people are fairly vulnerable, literally and figuratively, in the shower. And so for most people, you don't sit there and think, why is this guy talking to me? Is he trying to hit me up for something? Or is he trying to cozy me up or butter me up, to use some expressions? But Johnson did. He thought of that. And that's the master politician. He took all those showers just so he could know people and then figure out whether they were worth attaching himself to or getting to know them better. And so that was it. He wanted to know people, and he wanted to know powerful people, and he wanted to be their friend, or at least pretend to be their friend. So that's all fair to say. So Johnson, he's some would say devious, but he's certainly cunning. I say guile. There's certainly that with him. But he is an interesting character politically, one of the best politicians I've ever come across, along with Franklin Roosevelt, Bill Clinton, and a few others. Anyways, when it comes to Johnson the man, ego. And he could be an insufferable individual. Some would say, and I won't, use some profanity for Johnson. Say he was an insufferable profanity. That was some people who knew him would say that about him. Well, anyways, his ego, to kind of give you an idea, his nickname or his initials were LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ. Some of you have been to the LBJ ranch outside of Johnson City. Well, that's got his nickname. By the way, he bought that after he became wealthy, and he set himself up to kind of play the role of Texas cattle baron. And so he cut a figure. In addition to that, his wife's name is known historically as Lady Bird Johnson. And that wasn't her real name. Her real name was not LBJ, but he changed it unofficially, and everybody called her Bird or Lady Bird. And so her nickname, or rather her initials, were LBJ. And so he had 2 girls, and one was Lucy Baines, and the other is Linda Bird Johnson. So think about that. He had 2 daughters whom he affixed the initials LBJ. He had a beagle whom he called Little Beagle Johnson, LBJ. I mean, you go on down the list. He had it on his cuffs. He had it on his collar. He was very proud of it. And so, I mean, any man who would do that to his wife and kids and so forth had a pretty good-sized ego. He was vain. He was proud. He was a sexually aggressive man. I'm going to touch on that for a second. The man, Johnson, he pursued women with sometimes reckless abandon. Only one time could you say it almost threatened his career in the sense that he slept with the wrong woman. He was sleeping with a woman who was, I think her name was Alice Glass. Anyway, she was the wife of a prominent D.C. fixer and doer, wealthy man, and that could have hurt him quite a bit. But that was really the only time that he allowed his peccadillos to get in charge of it. But Lyndon Johnson was a first-class womanizer, and he himself knew it, and he made no bones about it. In fact, I mean, there are some. I won't tell this story and have it recorded because, well, I don't want to. But at the same time, there are stories off the record. If it was just you and me talking, I'd tell you. But long story short is that one of the things he would do, Johnson, was he talk. I'll say this one is that. Kennedy was a known womanizer. John Kennedy was a known womanizer, badly so. And Johnson and Kennedy had a rivalry. It was particularly acute between Bobby Kennedy, Jack Kennedy's brother, and who also himself got assassinated in 1968. So that contributed to things, along with Martin Luther King's assassination. So you can understand 1968 might be a big year. But anyways, Lyndon Johnson talking about his proclivities and Jack Kennedy's proclivities, he always said, and this is crude, this is Lyndon Johnson crude, so I want you to understand I'm not trying to be overly crude. I want you to understand what type of man you're dealing with here. And he would say, I got more women on accident than Jack Kennedy ever got on purpose. He didn't say that often, but he said it. And the thing is that, and there are more stories like that about his kind of open womanizing. And Lady Bird knew about it. There's no two ways about it. She knew about it. And people would ask her later on, especially in interviews and such, especially after LBJ was out of office and he was, or particularly dead, they'd say, what about your husband's womanizing? What about his philandering? And her response became, why, Lyndon just loved people. And that's the way Lady Bird say it. And she was humiliated at times by her husband. I mean, let's be honest. I mean, there were instances where he was being aggressive with a woman right next to Bird. There are other instances moving away from the sexual stuff. Lyndon Johnson could be harsh, cruel. I mean, he knew where he had the ability. He had a sharp enough mind. He was not a learned man in the sense that he could speak multiple languages like Theodore Roosevelt or ancient languages or anything like that. He was not smart like Woodrow Wilson as far as books are concerned. He was not a high intellectual. No one ever accused Lyndon Johnson of that. But the fact is that, say back to his relationship with his wife Bird, was the fact that when Lady Bird was, say she'd gained a few pounds, maybe because of the pregnancy of one of the daughters or whatever the reason may be, he would say to her, and maybe if she hadn't even gained weight, who knows? I don't know every jot and tittle, but I know this is that Johnson in circles there in Washington society, and if you do not know that Washington society can be as cutthroat and as aggressive, well, you just got to understand it is people call it the swamp, and there's some truth in that. But I've also heard it said over the years that Washington, D.C. is Hollywood for ugly people. And when it came to Johnson, around his wife and in front of other people in polite cocktail society in congressional Washington in the 1930s and 1940s, Lyndon Johnson would say at times in front of Bird and to Bird in front of other people, Bird, you're getting fat. Bird, you need to lose some weight. Or wake her up in the middle of the night and say, honey, I'm home. I need you to cook some meals for me. And she would do it. He treated her horribly. And for the longest time, it was just kind of one of those head shakers of why did he do that to her? Well, because she had hitched her wagon to him. By the way, so I'm clear about this, Lyndon Johnson and Lady Bird basically got married, or not got married, but got engaged more or less after the first time they went on a date. And so, I mean, just think about it this way, ladies especially, but even gentlemen. who are watching this. But just think about it, ladies. Would you get married to a man who, after more or less the first date, maybe the second, basically proposes and says, I need an answer sooner rather than later, like tonight or tomorrow. Please give me an answer. Would you get married to him? And in fact, most people would not. But Lady Bird Johnson comes from East Texas oil money. And so there's that geography coming back again. She comes from East Texas oil money. I think there's some cattle in there as well, maybe some cotton. Long story short is she had money, and that's part of the reason I'd argue Johnson married her or wanted to marry her. But she goes to her father, and her Bird's father basically says, sometimes the best deals in life are closed when you don't expect it, like that. And she said yes. To be fair, I think she, especially as the years passed and she realized she was married to a rising star and a prominent man, this is me being skeptical or maybe cynical or both. The thing is it sure seems like Bird, she'd hitched her wagon, so to speak, to a rising star, and she became first lady in the process. And so she put up with stuff in order to become first lady. She went as far as her husband did. And it's because in the 1940s and 50s, and even the 60s, a man who got divorced from his wife, or vice versa, generally speaking, that was the end of the line for presidential ambitions, and Johnson had them in spades. You may say that's harsh, but I mean, to this day, and probably since the dawn of time, in politics and in power circles, whether it's politics in an American sense or somewhere else, is that people have done a lot of things to be close to power, to be associated with it, to be prominent. I mean, a lot of folks will put up with a lot of things for it. So it may seem hard, but that's kind of the read I get of it. But I do want to end with this stuff with regard to the relationship between Bird and her, Lady Bird Johnson and Lyndon. And that is that Lyndon Johnson, later on, and this happened in the last 20 years or so, maybe 15, the LBJ public school and library over there at UT in Austin, they had all the recordings. And Richard Nixon wasn't the only man in American history, only president in American history to record his conversations. As it turned out, it was one of the dumbest things you could do. But Nixon recorded his conversations and helped get him basically, he would have been impeached, but he resigned instead. Lyndon Johnson recorded his conversations, as did Kennedy. Kennedy recorded his conversations. So for about a 10 to 15 year period, the White House was, if you went into the Oval Office, the microphones were recording on you. So it was like having your iPhone in your pocket, I suppose. Anyways, all of which is to say is that there are some recordings that were released years later in telephone conversations between Lyndon and Lady Bird Johnson. I'd like to say that Johnson was in Washington and Bird had gone back to the ranch or something like that. Maybe it may have been reversed. All that to say is they were separated and they were talking on the phone. And by that point in their relationship, it had changed enough, or maybe we sometimes cut Bird too little slack, that Mrs. Johnson was just reaming her husband out, and she wasn't being coarse and crude like he could be, but she was letting him know that on this issue or that issue, and it wasn't sexual in nature to my recollection, it was pretty much just politics and family life, that what he was doing was not okay, and he was not trying to slap her down in a sense verbally and say, be quiet, don't talk, that's none of your business. Basically, it was, yes, dear, and it kind of complicates and certainly humanizes, in a sense, their dynamic. But to Johnson's relationship with others, Lyndon Johnson's relationship to others is also worth a minute of our time. Lyndon Johnson, if you were over him or you had something he wanted, whether it was money or power or prestige, he could be awfully nice. He could be awfully generous. But if you worked for Lyndon Johnson, he'd treat you like a cut dog. And so I got some Texas expressions or country expressions, I was about to say cornball, but country expressions that are out there. I've got many of them. But he'd treat you bad. He would cuss you out. He would degrade you. He was a hard man to work for because he had you. You had a job that you probably wanted. You had a job that you liked, Maybe you had dreams about becoming a congressman yourself, maybe moving up the ladder, and you knew that Johnson could help you. And so you put up with a lot of stuff. Sometimes the way it would work is that famously, for example, he called a secretary into the bathroom with him one time, and he said, "I need to dictate a letter to you, or I need you to take notes," and he's on the commode. He would do that on the phone and let people know who were his subordinates. That he was, I mean, he kind of had a strange fixation with the bathroom, and I mean, while defecating, I mean, it's kind of bizarre at the best. But certainly, I would argue it would be like the proverbial alpha dog taking the food out of the mouth of the beta, using overworked phraseology. Anyways, Lyndon Johnson is that sort of man. He will do that to people, and he will go after you and treat you curtly. Also, last but not least, he was a sort, if you were eating at his dinner table and you were a kid or somebody he didn't respect or didn't care all that much about, just the way he was, he was the sun in the sky and everything else revolved around him for the most part. If you weren't eating your food fast enough, and I've read this from other accounts about other politicians of the same stripe, he would take, say if you're eating a steak dinner and you weren't eating it fast enough and he was hungry and he woofed his food, he'd reach over and grab that steak off your thing and then he'd eat it himself. You had pie or cake or whatever that you didn't eat fast enough or you weren't getting to because you were eating slower, he'd take your pie and just do it. He didn't ask for permission, he'd just do it. I mean, and he drank like a fish. He drank a fifth or more of blended Scotch whiskey called Cutty Sark every night, vodka too. Smoked like a chimney, about 3 or 4 packs a day. And oh, by the way, last but not least, all those Johnson men had bad hearts. They were prone to heart attacks. Lyndon had them. Sam Ely had them. Son is Sam Houston Johnson, which was a brother, had them. All those Johnsons had bad hearts, and so. Lyndon Johnson was actually going to have a heart attack when he was about my age, maybe a few years older, but it almost killed him. And he stopped his smoking for the most part, and he curtailed his drinking for the most part, and he dies of a heart attack when he's in his mid-60s because he was out of the presidency already. But where I'll pick up in the next lecture has to do with Lyndon Johnson as the man of the hill country and as a congressman and a senator, and I'll tell those stories, and that'll take another portion of our time today. Thank you.